fact that there's no change in the hardware of the human being, and yet our technology continues to advance, does not bode well for civilization. History shows us to be insular, expansionist, and violent. The efficiency with which we kill advances, but our clarity of consciousness does not. It is so opaque that we want to build empires to fill the void left by the disconnect from the truth of this moment. The fact that desire has ended for some suggests that it could do so for others. It's not just a matter of exposure to information, but also that it happens at a moment of ripeness. Spiritual pointings are as useless to the unripe as a campfire is to someone who's underwater. I used to live with a man named Frank who referred to himself as a hierophant. He spoke of and perhaps claimed to be a reincarnation of Hermes Trismegistus. I was 19 and he was in his early 50s. He looked like Santa Claus, about 6 feet tall and 280 pounds. I met him at a social gathering and I just started encountering him all over the place. At the time, I was living with a couple of friends, but they moved out to live with their girlfriends, leaving me to cover the rent for a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit. Frank was living in a trailer on the other side of town. He was making enough money playing piano to split the rent with me, so I moved him in. He was a psychic tarot card reader and player of New Orleans-style piano music, and he was a singer. He made a living playing and singing in a New Orleans-themed bar. He chain-smoked and drank a lot of vodka. He had a kind of Dizzy Gillespie voice with a southern lilt to it. This was before the internet was a really big thing. It was in the early 90s, and the internet was just starting to come into mainstream. He was on the internet in the very early days. He was using computers back when, if you wanted to do something, you had to write a program to do it. He had a master's in history. He could paint, he could sing, play piano, read tarot, and teach about the occult. These were the skills he used to make a living. He used to talk about all this antediluvian stuff, about how we were the result of aliens tinkering with the local species, and he had all these racial theories about how each people group represented some different experiment, saying we were the subjects of these demigods, these Pleiadians, Elohim. He was telling me about alien creation stories back then, about how, like, he and I, for example, were descendants of Zeus. He was like a walking Art Bell show. His life was interesting, and I'm not sure if anyone else is alive to talk about it. He died over 20 years ago, and he was an orphan when I met him. His whole family had been killed in a car wreck back in the 1950s when he was a kid, and he was left with some money to live on, and with that he got his education. Told me a lot of things that didn't make any sense at the time, teachings that were lost on me. He talked about the energy body and pranayama. At 19, I was 100% in unconscious identification with mind and body, so I had no sense of the energy body. What he was talking about was just a bunch of woo-woo to me. And that's a position I would maintain for over 20 years until a shaman's awakening spontaneously commenced in the midst of my life's upheaval. The upheaval was understood to be the product of unwanted thoughts, and there was a lot of energy behind them. In dealing with them through various forms of spiritual practice, a space was opened which revealed another facet of perception. Once the energy body is perceivable, or was perceivable. It provided a mechanism to expose when delusion was allowing thoughts to tap into and transmute it. When the energy body is perceivable, to be in fear for the future causes an intense burn. There is in this a strong impetus to be present, to expand perception into feelings rather than ideas. Feelings do not have the fingerprint of identity. They are not concepts that can latch onto other concepts. When awareness is in surrender to feelings, there is presence in that nothing resists reality. There is no timeline in pure feeling. Another misunderstood lesson was from my guitar teacher. This was when I was around 18. He talked about chakras and energy, and I just thought he was a weirdo. But he was just a couple years older than I was, so maybe he read a book. I caught up with him 30 years later, and he told me about how he got a musical interview with a major record label, and how they asked him in coded wording if he was a certain kind of practitioner. I won't repeat the phrases that they used, but he did not know what they were asking him about at the time. But later he did some research and figured it out. He said these guys were basically all into the occult. The knowledge of what liberates can be inverted to deepen bondage, and the exploiter of that knowledge need not have benefited from it in terms of freedom. In fact, a free being would have no impetus to manipulate others. It's identity that precludes freedom, and the cultivation of identification with superficial things and ideas deepens bondage. It gives the world things to attack within one's identity. If the spigot of information is centrally controlled, it is then easy to get predictable reactions from the mental constructs that have been intentionally formed through it. The media and academia not only shape the identity, but the media prods it into action with frightening narratives that relate to those constructed idols of self. It can be seen by how people in the West have formed into groups that live in different realities. To the extent that reality is interpreted through a lens of conditioning that's unconsciously identified with, there are people who are seeing different realities based on how they came to have the minds they have. There are people who just believe everything that comes from the institutions, despite their having been consistently contradicted by reality. If the information has been taken on as an identity, the source of that information will be as sacred as the self. People defend their conditioning. Experience can change people's minds about things. The identity can change shape. But despite that, the propensity to be identified with what's seen rather than only what sees will persist. And in that, suffering remains.